Hello everybody. Today we're doing a brush texture, or some people call it crow's foot, other people call it brush. There's so many different variations of this type of texture. It's overwhelming. There's also different type of brushes in the market. But this one we're just going to call it a stomp texture. I'm just using a basic round stomp brush that I got at the hardware store, large store that sold drywall tools, about $10 tool. This texture, crow's foot, stomp textures were done in the houses from the 50s, maybe early 60s. So we got called in here to do this large patch on a wall, basically doing the whole wall area. And I'm going to do what I call a stomp texture. Of course, different regions call it crow's foot, other regions call it swirl, brush, you name it, there's a name for it. But we're just going to call it stomp. With this stomp texture, there's a lot of guys out there that like to use a big old brush. They like to dunk the mud in the brush in the mud, and then they and then they stomp it in the big bucket of mud, stomp, stomp, back and forth, mud bucket, onto the wall. They make a big old mess. You get it all over your hand. The tool gets caked in mud. So what I like to do is just use a all-purpose joint compound, thinned down, nice and creamy. There's no clumps in it. If you have clumps and it's not mixed up well, it's not going to do good with this texture. So you want to mix it up pretty thin. I'd say about a pancake batter consistency. You can go with a thicker pancake batter consistency, but the thicker the mud you leave, heavier stipple, sharper peaks on the brush. So I like to do a thin mud with these. Most of them, the best finish is with a real thin mud. So like a thin pancake batter, not as thin as water, because you have to be able to put material on the wall. You can't just smear water on the wall. You have to have at least enough to get it on the wall, hold to the wall. Instead of dunking it in the bucket or dunking it in my pan, which you can do, I just like to put the mud on the area I'm working on. I'm just using a 12-inch knife, basically kind of skim coating. Does not a perfect skim coat because I'm just putting material on the wall. I've seen guys where they use a paint roller, they'll roll the paint on there, then use a brush. But we use knives, pans and knives where I'm located. So it's easier for me just to put the mud on with the pan and knife. And then once I get the mud on like this, I'm just gonna follow through with the brush. Depending on the brush you want to use, it's pretty much the same style. But there's other variations with this daub, crow's foot, brush texture. There's swirl patterns. Some guys stomp it, then do clockwise, stomp it, counterclockwise, like crescent moons, half moon patterns. So there's different variations with this daub. Real busy daub. If you want it real heavy, you would use a thicker mud, more mud on it. You just make it real thick and heavy and busy. With this, I like a thinner mud, and then you just taper that mud out. So if there's a lot of mud in the center, I'm going to take that brush in the center, and I'm just going to feather it out in all directions. You're fading out, feathering out the mud, the material. The more you fade it out and the more you work it, the less material is going to be on the wall, the less busy the texture is going to be. So sometimes less is better, at least in my world. Thin joint compounds, the thinner the better. That way the texture looks nice. If it's really thin and you stomp it out really well, you're going to get almost like a heavy, I'd say orange peel look, heavy egg peel. It'll just be really heavy. So the thinner the mud, the better. If you put on the mud super thick, really heavy mud, you didn't thin it down, it's going to be real heavy, ugly, busy, rough texture. If it's really rough, you rub against it, it'll cut your arm. That's how sharp the little peaks get on these with these brush peaks. So that's why you want to use a thin mud. I've seen guys where they thin the mud down, or if they put it on too heavy, the next day they'll turn around and pole sand it or sand it with 150 grit, and that kind of does a flat top technique, almost like a knockdown technique on all the brush tips. But this is a basic texture that anyone can do themselves. A basic box of joint compound thinned down in a bucket, and then you get yourself a brush like this. This is a round one. I've seen square ones, flat ones. There's so many variations on the market, but this brush is like $10. A box of mud, depending you are. Just say it's $10 for a box of mud, a brush. So you're doing a basic project texturing on a wall for less than 20, $30. So it's an easy texture that someone can practice on and learn how to do. I don't recommend you start texturing your whole house with this, but maybe like if you have a ugly wall that needs help, like an outside my house, I have a laundry wall that would probably look good with some texture on it because it's just smooth sheetrock, or like a garage, tool shed, just a room that needs some help. This is a perfect texture for you to use where you don't have to buy a hopper, learn how to do this and that. You could just use a brush and just dab, 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 and it'll freshen up the wall and clean it up. So, but practice makes perfection on this kind of texture. So you want to practice on a piece of sheetrock or practice with your technique until you get going. Also, once you start a pattern, just say if I'm doing dab, 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 I'm going to continue that same pattern throughout. Don't change it up halfway through the wall. You got to keep everything kind of symmetrical, nice, and keep a nice pattern going. So if I do a dab, swirl, I'm just going to keep that pattern, or I'm going to create my own pattern. Dab, dab, swirl, dab, 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 swirl, whatever. You just want to keep the same pattern and keep a nice uniform pattern. But practice with this. It's easy texture, crow's foot, daub, brush. It's been called everything, but in my area we just call it a crow's foot. I know it's not technically a crow's foot because a crow's foot uses a flat brush, but we just call it a crow's foot, and everybody knows in my trade, in my area at least, that it's from the older houses from the 50s, maybe 60s that have this older style texture. But yeah, simple video. Also, I'm going to have a video of the original video for this where I did the sheetrocking, got all sheetrock patched and ready for texture and texture process. The full video of this is also going to be on here. But this is a basic video, and I also have a whole other playlist of different type of textures. There's so many textures in the drywall world. This is just one of many, and that's why I'm putting it on the texture playlist. But if you haven't done it already, please subscribe, please like, go ahead and comment. Is this something you would put in your house? Well, I'd like to know about it. Start a discussion. What would you do differently with this? I've seen people tell me they'd put paint in it. I don't recommend putting paint on it. I recommend painting it afterwards. But I've seen guys put color their mud, and then when it dries, you'll get like a flat whatever color in. Like if I put some blue dye in it, I might get like a flat blue wall, something like that. So guys do put dyes in it and stuff like that. People say they put paint in it and texture. I don't recommend doing that because drywall mud has certain muds in it, glues and stuff like that. So when you dump latex paint in it, you're going to change the chemical makeup of the drywall mud, the chemical makeup of the paint. So it's easier just to paint afterwards. I know there's hard to cut corners, but that's not one of them. I know people have done it and they swear by it, but that's something we don't do. But you can put dye in it. I've even seen guys put like chalk line chalk in it, like a blue or red chalk. If you did that, you might get a different tint to the mud, blue or red. Whatever you want to do, just practice with it. It's a perfect texture for you to practice and hone your drywall mudding skills, texturing skills on. Easy to do it yourself. Hope you like it. Thank you.